Welcome to the Painter's Dialectic Podcast. My name is Josh Green, and I'm an artist and art educator living in New York City. And today, on October 12th, 2025, from 12 to 2 p.m., we are exploring Precious Human Rebirth, a core Buddhist teaching describing the rare and fortunate opportunity of being born as a human with freedom and conditions necessary to practice Dharma. So, Buddhist scholar Dylan Ahn presented the Buddhist perspective on this, and I thought it would be fun to present a Western version of it from the Hermetic tradition. This class, we did not have a meditation or an art project. It was just a philosophical discussion because we had our guest, Dylan. Enjoy! Welcome back, everyone. I'm happy to see you all, and we have Dylan here with us again, and it is October 12th, 2025. Today we're going to explore Precious Human Rebirth. Once again, for those who don't know me, my name is Josh Green. I'm an artist and art educator living in New York. I am certified to teach meditation through Tibet House and Dharma Moon here in Manhattan. I'm becoming certified to teach the Hermetic tradition through the Institute for Hermetic Studies. And I'm certified to teach art through the MFA at Alfred Dusseldorf Painting. Once again, we have theartisterrant.com, a website with courses and a lot of content for you to check out. And I will be updating that website soon. And we have a student gallery if you want to see the past students. I think we've done really well at keeping a high quality. And all the donations today are going to the Institute for Hermetic Studies collection at the Weinberg Memorial Library at the University of Scranton. So we're trying to establish a library of esoteric wisdom. It'll be the largest in the region, and a lot of rare books that aren't in public domain will be made public domain. So please contribute to that through the link in the email. And today, this will be a dialogue. So we'll present the philosophy. Me and Dylan will do that for hopefully 30 minutes, and we'll go into a dialogue with you guys, and then we'll do a dedication at the end. So, Precious Human Rebirth is a core Buddhist teaching describing the rare and fortunate opportunity of being born a human with the freedom and conditions necessary to practice the Dharma. So Dylan's going to present the Buddhist perspective, but I thought it would be fun to present a Western version of this teaching because it's not very well known from the Hermetic perspective. For me, this teaching is foundational to my spiritual life and probably the idea that affected me the most. In essence, what it's getting to is, do I have free will? Do I have a choice? And if I don't, how can I gain free will and how can I gain more and more of it? And also, what it points to is, what is your life for? Why are you here? How are you going to spend your time? Right? And you get to choose that. How do I want to spend this precious time, this precious human rebirth, if you do have free will? If we don't have free will, then spirituality is a waste of time. In order for spirituality to work, I have to have the capacity to make creative decisions. If that is not the case, then I'm completely determined and just enjoying the ride. So, in the Western philosophical context, free will is the capacity of rational agents to choose their actions independently of external coercion or internal necessity. That is, to act according to their own deliberation and intention rather than being entirely determined by fate, divine will, or natural causation. More precisely, free will in the West is the idea that human beings are to some degree self-determining agents capable of conscious, intentional action, and thus responsible for their moral and existential condition. That's very important. If we're determined, we're not. If the point of your life is just to win and to get a lot of toys, this teaching isn't for you. If your life is about growing up, getting a degree, having kids, paying bills, and dying, if there's nothing more than that, this teaching isn't for you. There needs to be a deep longing to go beyond, to break out of the box. There must be a deep curiosity that pushes you deeper and deeper past your beliefs and past your fears, beyond and beyond. So someone, and also a part of this is maybe at some point in your life you're terrified of death and you wanted to find a way to deal with it, to deal with the mystery of death. So free will also, um, in the Hermetic tradition, requires some degree of self-awareness or lucidity. If you're unself-aware, what would that be like? What would it be like if you did not have free will? It would mean your life would be like a dream. That's how we consider the ground consciousness is it's like a dream. You're reactionary. You're responding, flowing through this um, projection of your hallucinations. In my lineage of Hermeticism, the divine seed, so at the top of this, you see a one. This is where the energies from the subjective being enter the manifest world. So here, the divine human seed enters the manifest world in a state of blissful ignorance, right? It is divine, but it has no wisdom. And then there, the line that says A, just below the center of the symbol of Saturn, that's where you cross into space-time. So the three upper levels are outside of space-time. And then you descend through increasing levels of density until you get to the very bottom. It says 10, and that's called Malkut. Earth is Malkut in the realm of Asaya, the realm of action. And you see the line there that says BD. That's kind of a threshold of forgetting what's above, forgetting the spiritual nature. And so once you enter the realm 10, you go down through this evolutionary process from mineral life to plant life to animal life to human life. And this isn't necessarily just on our world, this could be spread throughout the universe. So once you're reaching human life, you're getting into the deepest density, and until you reach a point of max density called the nadir, the initiation of the nadir. And at this point, you've probably done a lot of horrible things, um, but something breaks, something changes, and you gain a bit of free will. And from that point on, you're now responsible. And then you begin an ascent. As you gain more self-consciousness, you ascend back through the realms until you reach eternity. And once you've reached that, you're enlightened. But this is a natural process. So everyone, even if they don't do spiritual practice, will go through this over the course of billions of years. But the point of doing a hermetic practice is you can understand the nature of this process and speed it up. That's the idea of the magician, is that they can harness this and speed up the process and complete the ascent in maybe, 100 or 12 lifetimes. So that's how they're thinking about it. So in order for this to be accomplished, to do this practice, you need to be born in a time of relative peace, right? If you're in a war zone, you're not going to have time for this. Or if life is too hard, you're not going to have time for this. Usually, this tradition does well when there's a healthy middle class. Um, so in that middle class, you'd have extra financial resources, you'd have leisure time, you'd have access to teachings, and a lineage holder who has completed the path within your lifetime, right? So these communities come together and support each other because you can't really do it alone. And it takes a mindset of service, of talent. You have to have various skilled people to maintain this group. You need treasure, the teachings, and you need time. People have to donate time and money to keep this small community alive. It's a group effort. The Hermetic tradition takes very seriously science and incorporates modern science and philosophy. So, dealing with people like Robert Sapolsky and his book Behave is very important. I read this book over the course of 6 months, maybe like 5 or 6 years ago, and it really impacted me. It's a monumental work that explores why humans act the way they do, from moments of kindness to acts of cruelty. It weaves together insights from neuroscience, psychology, endocrinology, anthropology, and sociology to reveal how behavior is shaped across multiple timescales from the millisecond. So it shows how you act, how you're determined from the millisecond to millennia of evolution. And he really tries to put the nail in the coffin of free will. And I think it's something that every spiritual seeker should take very seriously because it is a strong argument. Um, that we may feel like a lot of things we're doing are our choice, but are actually determined by subconscious forces. So, uh,
Mm.
one scientist I like is Peter Zay. He writes about, from a physicalist perspective, free will from a neuroscientific level. And he says we can find it in people who train volitional attention and imagination. That through imagination, we're able to develop higher levels of free will. He talks about the imagination of an animal to decide the best way to attack a prey. And then he has a higher level of imagination or able to combine abstract concepts. So really, this free will is also dependent on are you able to imagine or are you able to communicate abstract concepts? So in order to gain more free will, you have to have voluntary and stable attention. This is the core idea. You have to have productive use of your leisure time. If you spend your leisure time on entertainment, then it's a death sentence. You have to use your leisure time, at least some of it, productively towards a spiritual goal and have discipline. You train vivid and controlled imagination. You have to develop a high morality and ethical life. Advanced students go into lucid dreaming, breaking that dream state, that determined state. Mystical devotion and controlling one's energies are all core practices of becoming completely free. And now I'll pass it to Dylan. I thought you'd use this. I got the 6 realms here. If you want to use that, Dylan.
Yeah, I mean, we could start from here. So one way of interpreting sort of human birth is to do it, as the picture indicates, in terms of the types of beings we can be. So one traditionally thought core belief or principle within Buddhism is this idea of reincarnation, and that is related to something called karma, which translated into English just means volitional action. So a willed, intentional action, that is karma. And of course, it comes in three flavors. There's action of the mind, action of the body, and action of speech. And the theory and the principle is that these actions are divided into wholesome and unwholesome ones. And the idea is that if you do unwholesome actions, you'll have unwholesome effects, right? Unwholesome things will happen. If you do wholesome things, then wholesome things will happen. And these occur within one's life as well. In relation to reincarnation, the principle goes that it also determines or conditions where you end up being reincarnated into. So if you've done a lot of good things, the idea is that you'll be reincarnated into sort of a better set of circumstances. You'll become a deva or a god or become a rich person or whatever. And if you do poorly through karmic standards, then you'll become a hungry ghost or an animal, uh, go to hell. If you've done good things in your life, but you're particularly jealous and envious, you'll become sort of what the sort of picture says, a demigod. So you'll have godlike abilities, but because of your envy and jealousy, you'll be in a constant state of conflict, is the idea. So there are different schools of thought regarding this particular teaching. Some people take this picture to be metaphysically real, right? So these realms genuinely exist. There is genuinely the notion of karma and wholesome action and wholesome rebirth, right? There's genuinely the notion of reincarnation and so on and so forth. So that's one school of thought. However, taking a closer look at the Buddha's teaching, you'll realize that actually this concept is not as important for the Buddha and not really that big of a deal within the Buddha's teachings. So one example of this is when he was talking to the Kalamas, when he was teaching them critical thinking, he makes note of a very interesting observation and point. And he says that, a person who lives a virtuous life, who lives a spiritual life and practices spiritually, um, wins four assurances. And in these four assurances, he basically says that if a virtuous person genuinely does believe in karma, in cause and effective action, well, they win the assurance that, okay, I've done good things, and so good things will happen to me. I can rest at ease. But even if a person does not believe in karma, the nature of a good action, the nature of a wholesome action, the very definition of a skillful, wholesome action is that which leads you to being at ease, at psychological ease. So spiritual practice is good precisely because it gives you benefits now. And so regardless of one's belief about karma, it's irrelevant to spiritual practices. It is unnecessary to believe it. And he says the same thing about reincarnation. So if you believe in a past and afterlife, good on you, right? You do good things. You expect to have good rewards. It'll bring you psychological peace. But even if you don't, right, the very nature of ethical living and spiritual living brings you benefits in the now. So the Buddha basically dismisses this idea that belief in reincarnation and karma is necessary for spiritual practice. As far as the Buddha is concerned, it is not the point. It's not really about preparing for a better birth or a better outcome. It's about trying to make peace with yourself psychologically now. It's for your mental health at this current moment. However, right, why bring this up at all? Well, it's worth bearing in mind the Buddha was living in a time where these beliefs were held to be very, very important and dear. This is not just, and it's not an exclusively Buddhist picture. This is a very Vedic picture, a very Hindu picture. These are already concepts that exist within the belief systems of the particular interlocutors that he was engaging with. So it is instrumental for the Buddha to relate to these concepts as a means of selling the spiritual life. So if you already believe in karma, if you already believe in reincarnation and rebirth, well, I will speak to you and I will teach you the spiritual life in those terms as a means of encouraging you to do so, right? So if you believe that doing good things will give you good rewards as a way of motivating you to do good things, well, one way to sell this idea is to tell you, well, if you do good things will happen to you. Whether that is true or not is besides the point. The point is that we would like you to do good things to suffer less. The other sort of nuance is the nature of reincarnation itself. So it's called reincarnation, it's called rebirth, but actually the term in the Pali at least is not that at all, right? So in Buddhism, rebirth and reincarnation is without transmigration. There is no soul that transmigrates between one vessel to the other, right? So it's not like you have a vessel in which there's some water and you transfer the water to another vessel. That is not how reincarnation works. The Buddha thinks that that sort of leans itself to this eternal and permanent notion of the soul. And the Buddha simply rejects this idea. We are impermanent and ever-changing beings, right? Reincarnation, the relationship between one's so-called past and afterlife is merely a cause and effect relationship. So an example of this would be a seed and a tree, right? A tree grows old, right? Has a seed. The seed sort of gets into the ground and becomes a new tree, right? This new tree and this old tree are genuinely different trees, right? But they have a cause and effect relationship, but they are different trees. As for us, our this life, so called, and our so called afterlife, those are genuinely the lives of different people. They're not the same person, not the same soul. They merely have a cause and effect relationship. So in a sense, you can imagine that your parents are kind of like your past life, and the children you'll have are a kind of afterlife. So the Buddha doesn't believe or doesn't teach this idea that somehow there is anything more substantial linking one's past or afterlife other than this notion of cause and effect. And even you could say that the person that I am now, the person that I am 10 years after, well, there's no sort of same soul sort of interlinking these things either. It is merely a cause and effect relationship. I'm biologically and causally related to me now and me 10 years later, and there will be many differences you can spot. So why the emphasis on being born in the human realm? Well, for one, the idea is that the Buddha is speaking to humans now. And the very sort of meaning, the point of the teaching, the reason why he sells the how precious human birth is precisely to get the humans that he is talking to make the most of the human life that they currently have. So he speaks to Ananda about this, and he says, well, as an analogy, imagine there was a very, very wide ocean, and on the ocean there floats a plank of wood with a hole in it, right? And every once in a while, I think it was every 1,000 years, right? A turtle sort of emerges from the depths of the ocean and pops its head up. And uh, every once in a while, it manages to pop its head up right into the hole of a plank in a vast ocean. That is how unlikely the odds are of you in particular having a human birth, having a human body. At the end of that teaching, he basically gets to his point. He says to Ananda, because of how unlikely the human birth is, that's why you should make the most out of it. Do not waste your time. Do not waste the life that you have. Make the most of it. And so a lot of emphasis is put on the idea of somehow human birth being precious, but actually the Buddha's point is you have a human life now. That is already a fact. Make the most of it. If he were to be talking to a god, he might be talking about how precious being a god is. If he was teaching an animal, he would tell you that it is just as precious. Of course, a human birth also has some advantages. So, not being in a state of deprivation, um, unlike an animal, for instance, we are given certain advantages to practicing the spiritual life. We have certain luxuries that allow us to engage in meditation and critical thinking. These options are not available to other beings in the world. That being said, you'll notice that each of the so-called realms actually exist within the realm that we live in, right? So the gods of our lives are those who live very, very luxurious, very privileged lives. And the drawback of that kind of life is that being obsessed with sensuality and material goods doesn't really give you much motivation to practice and to alleviate your own suffering because you do not believe that you are suffering. You're immersed in great pleasures and distractions, right? We know and we are aware of the aggressive amongst us who are envious and jealous of the goods of others. We are aware of animals. We are aware of those other humans who live as if they were hungry ghosts in a state of deprivation and poverty, in a state of war. And we know those who live in their hell in a state of maybe psychological sort of distress or in captivity or in a state of great physical pain, right? So another way of understanding all of this is to reflect this into our own lives. There need not be genuinely these metaphysical realms that exist. It could just be used as a symbol of all of these different realms that already exist in the life we live. The other sort of aspect, so since Josh, you talked a little bit about the metaphysics of being. There's a similar principle in Buddhism, similar to determinism, called dependent origination. And basically, the Buddha's teaching on dependent origination is very, very, very determined, although they call it conditioned. The idea is that we are sort of observably not free at all. We are conditioned by many things from a scientific perspective. You can say we're conditioned physically, biologically, psychologically. We say we make volitional choices, but those volitional choices are also conditioned by other things: childhood, upbringing, culture, circumstances, the friendships we hold, our psychological inclinations and impulses, biological desires, and so on and so forth. And the Buddha also has a very similar picture. He believes that suffering and our existence, our phenomenal existence of the world, is likewise conditioned in different ways. So the 12 link chain, the Buddha calls, begins with ignorance, right? So like your picture, it begins with ignorance. And that is a lack of awareness of why we suffer, of the nature of our suffering, how to cease suffering, and the way to cease suffering. That is a kind of ignorance, a lack of awareness, a lack of paying attention to what's going on in our lives. This conditions something called volitional formations, right? The formation of will, right? So we think of will and volition, we need an object. I want something. I want to do something. I want to see someone. There's an object involved. So all will, all volitional formation, that in itself is conditioned by our ignorance. It is because we misdiagnose or we do not pay particular attention to what's going on. That is what gives rise to volition, to will, to choice, right? If we knew everything, there would be no choice. Choice is built upon the idea that we are uninformed, right? If we knew everything, there would be no choice involved. So then that conditions consciousness, which is discrimination of our different senses. And that conditions something called name and form. I won't go into sort of detail here because of time. That conditions the six sense bases and so on. And then uh, through the next few steps, we finally get to conditioning something called existence. So having developed sensation and feeling and craving and clinging, there is the idea of existence, right? So it's not that somehow this is a metaphysical principle and having these things births us into life. It's that we mistake these things as a kind of identity, as an existence. We tell ourselves a story that, oh, this thing means that I'm somehow, there is a me, there is an eternal, unchanging core me here, and that is something called an existence, right? There is an identity, and that gives rise to something called birth, right? That identity solidifies, right? So, for example, if you identify yourself in terms of three things, the Buddha says, well, there could be sensual becoming, form becoming, formless becoming. We identify ourselves to different things. But let's say, you identify yourself with creation and art, for instance. And then there will be a moment in your life where you solidify this idea that I am an artist now. There is a birth of the character of the artist. There is a name to the character that I play. So that is a notion of birth. And then there is finally aging, decay, or death. So eventually, this character, the label that you ascribe to the thing that you identify with, no longer fits reality, right? So let's say you identify yourself as an artist, but you reach a point where you're so ill or you're so old that you can no longer create art in the way you would conceive of art, and that starts to fall apart. And the Buddha says, well, this is what conditions suffering. We set up an expectation of an identity, and when that identity no longer corresponds with reality, with the nature of what we are, that leads to suffering. So that is one way of conceiving of conditionality. There are different lists of different sizes that the Buddha gives, but the basic idea is that we are not in control of much of our lives. One thing conditions the other. There is a way out. So even though the Buddha denies free will explicitly, since volitional formation is also conditioned, he also denies something called karmic determinism. So the other side of the picture is also not true. It's not the case that we are completely determined. It's just that the thing that we are free to do is not will. Rather, it's something called wise attention. So when the Buddha was sort of meditating under the tree, when he describes his enlightenment process, he points at a particular faculty, a particular ability that causes a breakthrough of wisdom that allows for liberation from conditionality. And this thing is called wise attention, the basic ability to be aware of what is happening. So you can call this basic awareness or raw awareness, wise attention. These are different names for it. But similarly to what we spoke about last time, it's essentially the ability to pay attention to what we pay attention to, the ability to pay attention to how we think and how we are conditioned. And by knowing and being aware of the rules of conditionality, that allows us to be liberated from it. So not free will in the strictest sense, but will with free origins, because by being aware, that itself conditions a kind of volition. So it's not that once you're enlightened, you don't do anything, but the thing that you are doing is now coming from awareness. Your will is now being informed by wisdom rather than ignorance. So not free will in the strictest sense, but will with free origins, according to this picture. So what is the point of this picture, and how does this support our sort of practice? So some supporting factors of practice. There are different levels. I think perhaps one of the more relatable summaries the Buddha gives is this particular teaching referred to the blessings teaching or protection teaching, in which the gods ask the Buddha, what is the highest blessing in the world? What is the highest protection in the world? And the Buddha gives some general advice on how to support your own practice. And the first thing he sort of advises is not to fraternize with fools, but to fraternize with the wise. So the very first thing the Buddha puts emphasis on is good company, right? Having sort of wise people to speak with, to socialize with, because a lot of our environment conditions who we are. The people we keep company with conditions how we are. And so we keep the company of good and wise people, then we're more likely to be supported and good. The next thing he says is to honor those worthy of honor, to have a sort of ideal or a symbol, have a personal hero to be a goal, essentially. So psychiatrists often talk about this when dealing with addiction. I sort of read a paper about how people who are trying to quit smoking will often keep a list of the goals that they're trying to achieve or some sort of ideal. And so that's quite useful in spiritual practice, is that we may not be there yet, but it's good to have an idea of where we'd like to be. Where are we going? Then there is living in a suitable region, right? So something that we mentioned before is like, what if we cannot find good company, but maybe it's a question of locality, right? Go to a place where you can find these people, right? Go to a place where it can support your spiritual practice, right? Also, being rightly resolved in oneself to make merit. So this is just code for ethical being, trying to live a good life. Also, the Buddha emphasizes some practical benefits, practical practices of support as well. He advises to have education and a craft, right? Have discipline and training, have a means of livelihood to be able to support yourself, right? So if you are struggling to put food on the table, you're going to struggle with spiritual practice, right? So engage in some kind of learned craft, right? Engage in some sort of discipline and training. Also, to be well spoken in speech, to be a good communicator is going to help you in your spiritual path, either in seeking out the wise. Um, there's a sort of underlying sort of advice here. Well, you may want to, socialize with the wise, but those wise may not want to socialize with you. right? And so there's also an element of building yourself up to be a person that the wise would like to hang out with, right? And so being disciplined, being ethical, being well spoken is going to help in that endeavor, is the idea. The next thing is to care for one's parents, uh, be kind to children and partners that you're going to have, so social relationships. Um, Try to engage in unstressful work, right? If you're constantly in a state of stress, that's not going to help with spiritual practice. Be giving and generous. Um, be kind to relatives. Try to have blameless deeds, right? Trying not to have a bad reputation, right? These things will support you. Um, Desisting and abstaining from sort of unhelpful and evil practices, right? Avoid drinking alcohol, right? In the sense that if you're trying to develop awareness, you're going to need an element of lucidity and clarity. Um, Diligence in good qualities. So not only is it enough to engage with good qualities occasionally, but to practice it with perseverance. And then he ends with sort of some personal psychological qualities like respect, humility, contentment, gratitude, patience, right? Being easy to teach, right? So if you're going to engage with wise people, if you're really difficult to teach, that makes it unlikely for the wise to want to hang out with you. Timely discussion of spiritual things, right? So obviously, you can't discuss these things all the time, right? There's an appropriate time and place, right? That's something to bear in mind. Um, Fervor and chastity, right? So some discipline in regarding your sensual pleasures, realization of spiritual practices. And so if you have these qualities, and these are good qualities to develop, though being touched by worldly conditions, by conditioned phenomena, what seemingly is determined, the mind need not tremble, the Buddha describes, right? So the mind is unmoved, despite the fact you are conditioned by all of these things. And this is what the Buddha calls the highest blessing, the highest kind of protection. Of course, in greater detail, the Buddha just, talks about the Noble Eightfold Path. This is a more detailed version of these supporting conditions for liberation. But I think for our purposes, this is a very kind of general, relatable set of advice for what to do and could be very helpful for any kind of spiritual practice. So, what do you think?
I think basically it's just getting you to consider um, the prerequisites of practice and if there's things in your life inhibiting you from practice too. I think that's kind of one of the main ideas. And you have to have leisure time to do this stuff. But if you're spending all that time on Instagram or whatever, then you're wasting this precious human life, this chance to become freer, right? To transform yourself, to shape yourself as you like. And also, I think it's a very creative thing because when we think of evolution, you don't really have a choice in it. These forces external to you work on you. So really what we're talking about is self-creation, like you as the art product, um, using your creative abilities to create yourself, self-creation. That's a big idea in the Hermetic tradition is self-creation. But also, as you go through deeper levels of meditation, you get to a point where you stop identifying with your thoughts or your emotions, and you're asking bigger questions about what am I? And you start identifying with kind of the ground of consciousness, the space in between thoughts, just this natural luminous awareness. And once you identify with that, you gain a lot of freedom because you're not identified with the story. Everything you used to identify with is something that's completely changeable and malleable. I can change how I think about myself. I can change the thoughts I have. I can change my habits with a lot of effort. There's nothing that's essentially me but this luminous awareness. And it's the same awareness that you have, right? The invisible speaker in me is the same invisible listener in you. There's no real difference. So there's kind of this discovering a unified beingness between all people. And then you can have empathy for, people you don't like, your enemy, because they're that same luminous awareness that's accumulated harmful thoughts, harmful habits. So when you hate someone, what you're really hating is that lower level of their being, their thoughts and habits and their emotions. It's not actually their true nature. The true nature, the true luminous self-awareness is never touched, really. It's always pure. It receives whatever you plant in there. Um, but it looks like in the Buddhist, the will isn't very important, but the will is the highest level of achievement in the Western tradition, gaining a powerful will, um, a will that can kind of break laws, break physical laws. And so you do that through each of those levels. Once you become free here, you become free in the lower lunar realms and then in the solar realms until you finally break out of eternity. Because there's these levels of um, of natural laws you have to overcome. That's why I said last time, enlightenment's kind of like becoming a lawbreaker. You see people doing it through crime, or you see people doing it the lawful way, but either way, you're trying to overcome the laws of nature. That's becoming free. All right, there's my statement.
Yeah, I think the difference is not necessarily that big. It's not that will doesn't necessarily play any role. Like obviously it does in any sort of action. In the sort of beginning stages of spiritual practice in Buddhism, will plays a huge role. Like it decides what you're going to do and how you conceive of what you're going to do. But in the latter stages of psychological development, there is a distinct putting aside of the will. So when the Buddha describes this later psychological progression through joy and tranquility into equanimity and things like that, the Buddha says, well, no will is needed in those processes. And the reason for that is that will attaches itself to an object, right? There needs to be an object for a will. I'm going to do something. And the idea is that you want to purify your awareness by leaving aside of your conceptions of objects, what objects are like. You want to just feel without conceiving. So in meditation, you really want to feel without wanting to do something, right? You want to sort of be able to sit and just absorb without necessarily imprinting action. So it's part of it, but not like the whole part. So it is still important. It depends on how you use it, right? So if your goal is to be a bodhisattva and you want to change aspects of the conditioned world, you want to help others, then yeah, will comes back to becoming a very, very important thing. But the idea is that that is now accompanied with awareness and wisdom rather than ignorance. So the ignorant will is not free, and the aware will it would be free.
And also, you can't skip this by not doing actions. That's another big thing in the West.
Mhm.
It's more like the good is a balance, but it's a dynamic balance, like a ballerina.
Mhm.
It's easier to maintain balance if you're moving, like riding a bike. So if you just stop doing stuff, that's just stagnation. You're not getting anywhere. You have to learn how to kind of master life and dynamically respond through like profound wisdom and training, or knowing how to handle all these moments and maintain an equanimity through life. Hopefully without creating too much karma, good or bad, because both of those keep you stuck in space-time.
Yeah. That's quite an important sort of thing, like balance. So there is like the practice of samatha, which is stillness and concentration, but there is also the active practice of vipassana, right? That is an active thing, right? The insight aspect of awareness is very, very active. People often call like Tibetan Buddhism Buddhism of the passions. There is an emphasis of activity within Tibetan Buddhism. But I think they sort of that is kind of a stereotype, because in Tibetan Buddhism, although there is an active principle, there is also a huge emphasis on the passive principle as well. You just need both. It has to be a balance. It can't be one way, too much one way or the other. If you're only concerned with stillness and samatha, sort of some of the Mahayana teachings sort of make fun of practitioners like that by calling them no better than a tree branch, right? Useless, unmoving, right? Very, very still and very, very tranquil, but not very useful, is the idea.
The advanced Buddhist practices, at least in the Tibetan ones, are the ones I've seen. Um, you witness that grounded being, that blank awareness, right? And then you practice going into that in a seated position. And then the next step is to do that throughout your day for a few seconds. And so it's called trekcho. It's like a cutting through. So you're cutting through thoughts and emotions and perceptions through the day. It's like you just notice this gap. And you don't try to sustain it. You don't try to stabilize it. You make it a habit. You use karma actually to habituate your enlightenment, to make it automatic. So over like a decade, you start relating from that empty awareness all the time. And that's the goal. Um, in the Western tradition, they call it the Ein Sof R, the endless fields of light. It is the true subjective being, and it is empty. It's a creative nothingness, and it's very close to Tawa in the Tibetan. But it is the real thing, and it's nothing. It's creative nothingness. And so everything that has a form um, is the manifest, is actually illusory. The true essence of you cannot be known. It can be known apophatically by negation. And so by not relating to thoughts and emotions and these things, you find this vast openness and that is behind all forms. And that's when we talk about eros, the desire. Um, Tibetan uses a lot of sexual imagery too, but so does the West, especially Gnostics. Sophia is kind of that vast openness. So the sexual energies stop going out. They're also the creative energies stop going out and they start going inward. That's what you're trying to merge with. You're trying to become one with. So this active mind is something you create, but you try to combine it with the true essence, right? Um, so that's kind of the end of the path is this union between the true subjective being, which is nothingness, and the creation. That might be a lot.
Just want to add, this reminds me of something, of course, I just heard um, maybe 2 days ago, where they say that the thoughts that we have are not truly ours. The thoughts that we have are external to us. What we are is the person who's listening to the thoughts. That's our true essence. So, and the idea is that the more distance we create from our true selves, the listener, from these thoughts that are trying to gain our attention, the more awareness we have, and the closer we can get to our true selves, the closer we can get to like that, higher self. And you can get there through meditation. The Sufis get there through zikr, which is the repetition of the name of God, or a concept, just to get closer to that. And for me, it kind of it blew me away as a psychologist, when we talk about intrusive thoughts. But this concept that I had just read about talks about how all thoughts are intrusive thoughts, because we are actually listeners. And, with the exception of that higher self voice that guides us and the goal is to be able to be in tune with that higher self. And any of the desires that we have, any of the attachments that we have, get in our way to trick us into thinking that the whole that we have is lacking because our desire hasn't been fulfilled. But the truth is that the whole that we have is because we are not connected to higher self, and we're tricked into thinking that external things will fill that void. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's the hedonia. If you remember that, were you there for that? Hedonic, trying to get wellness through external means, right? So the eudaimonia is the wellness flows outward. And in the traditions we're talking about, it would be the in Buddhism, the Dharma Kaya, I guess, or in Hermeticism would be the Ein Sof R, that endless light. And within that light, there's no fear because you're nothing. Nothing can extinguish you. And there's a basic joy. It's not an. It's not like the normal. It's just this pleasantness. There's a natural love, which is like it's not like what we think of as like there's just no boundaries anymore. There's nothing outside of you anymore. You see the world as yourself, all beings as yourself. Everything
Yeah,
is you
all connected. Yes,
at
absolutely.
this level. But you also are your emotions and thoughts. But when you're in that stage of practice, you learn to disassociate with it. And then at the end, you bring it all together because you become whole again. But you have to witness that level of yourself, which is what is hard to see because it's so subtle. Because your mind and life are usually so busy, you never notice this subtle layer of you. It's like the fish not recognizing the water, kind of idea.
Right, right. And also, I think that that Sanskrit quote of, are careful for your thoughts because they become your words, and careful with your words because they become your behaviors, and so on and so forth. Um, and I think it all starts from the thought for sure. But, for me, it was really powerful and fascinating to understand that concept of our thoughts may not truly be who we are. We get to choose what thoughts we pay attention to. We get to water those thoughts, um, and pay attention to them, or dismiss them. And it was fascinating to me to to see it in that sense as a psychologist, because I mean there's a whole field of cognitive behavior therapy that talks about dealing with our thoughts and our perceptions and our cognitive biases, um, to then change our behaviors. The idea that our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, those three things, are one um, big triangle. Each one is a corner of the triangle, and if you change one corner, you change all three. Um, because what they're not independent of each other. They all kind of work cohesively together. And the easiest one to change is not our feelings. Um, the easiest one to change frequently is our behavior, not even our thoughts. So, you change the behavior, and therefore you then can see that the thought changes as a result. And that was one of the exercises that you and I did, just brushing our teeth with our left hands, and doing things that we don't typically do, because when that happens, then we shift. We move
Mhm.
out of that place, that rut that we've been caught in. Um, yeah, really fascinating um, stuff in terms of the process. And one of the things that really, as I was reading this, it said that when you embody this, when you understand this, when you adopt this, you will never grieve and you will never worry, and you won't judge either. All of those things fall away, because when you have a better understanding of, there is no loss. We're all connected. We continue to be connected in a different way, perhaps. When you recognize that everyone is within you and you are within everyone, we are all connected. You don't get angry at other people, and you don't have worries about situations happening, because you know that it's always going to happen for your greater good, because a lesson will come of it, and then you'll rise. And just since I read this 2 days ago, I've found myself, even with, before, when you asked, any thoughts from anybody, I was on a ladder with my head in the attic, um, because I had a light bulb that I had to change, and the only way to do that was that way. And when the light bulb went out, my first thought was, rats, but then I thought, I think something positive will come of this. And sure enough, it did. I discovered something in my attic that I hadn't known was there. And had I not had that light bulb, and it's kind of funny because, we talk about the light bulb going off or whatever. But had that not, happened, all of these discoveries. So it's just, to me, it's not just like the major life events, it's the little ones, it's everything. And just yesterday I was in Beacon at a Beacon Flow event where there's a lot of healing practitioners who were all there and taking part, and I was volunteering for a little while. And there was a chiropractor there. No, I'm sorry, an acupuncturist who was there. And really great, wise person. But he was all out of sorts because the space that he was given wasn't ideal. The organizer had said he was going to be the only one. There were others, and he was just all out of sorts. And I said to him, I wonder if there's a lesson in all of this. What do you think it is? And he got to talking, and he was like, you know what? I realize now that the lesson is that I was upset because I didn't think that I would get the clientele that I wanted. But in truth, this is exactly who I want. And he recognized that he was all out of sorts because he didn't think it should go the way it was. But then when he kind of followed that path and said, what is this going to lead to? He recognized he's exactly where he needed to be. So, and I feel like I've had a lot of those moments. I imagine Dylan and Josh and Till, you have as well. But there have been many times in my life where I say to myself, there's deeper meaning to this. What is it? And as simple as a light bulb going out. I wonder where this is going to take me. This is really fascinating. And when you are met with challenges and you meet them with curiosity and without judgment, without saying this is good or this is bad, no expletives, you just accept it. It is just such an easier way of being. Oh my goodness. Such an easy way of being. So just curious if you've had similar experiences.
Can I show you something right now? I'd like to show you practice. And actually, Pam, this would be good for what we've been talking about too. All right, so can everyone just imagine a large subway train just in front of them in this space? Just imagine it now. Okay, you got it? Where is that? Where is that visualization? Okay, when you start having thoughts that are bothering you, instead of judging it's good or bad, try to find where is the thought, right? I can imagine a little unicorn on the tip of my finger. Can anyone see it? No. Shift shift from what you're thinking as a judgment statement to where is it? And when I was working with the Lama, she gave me this one. She told me I was too intellectual. She said she was like, Why don't you find your mind for me? I want you to go home and I want you to start with your toes and work all the way up through your body until you find your mind and then come back to me. And so I did. I sat at home like an idiot, going, is my mind in my toe? Is my mind in my kneecap? Is my mind in my finger? And you end up finding the mind by not finding it. I don't know. What do you think, Dylan?
Yeah, this is a common sort of what they call a case or a koan in Zen, but in Chinese Buddhism as well, right? The finding of, in this case, the mind, but also sometimes the self, right? You think, okay, where is this core thing that I am? Where is my consciousness? Where is my soul? And of course, the answer is, of course, you cannot find it because it isn't there, right? It's not a substantive thing, it's an activity. There's a sort of fine line there. Of course, some people think, oh, if I can't find it, therefore it doesn't exist, right? That's the other extreme that should be avoided. Well, clearly it does exist because you're doing it, but it doesn't exist in any substantive way. It exists as an activity. It's the closing, it's the ability for a door to open and close. Try and find that. It doesn't exist, right? But it clearly does because the door can, as an ability, open and close. The mind is the same way. The ability for the mind to take notice, be aware is an ability, right? It's not a thing you can hold on to. And so there is a similar concept in Spinoza's philosophy where being is doing, right? The thing that we are is not a substance. Rather, we should reconceive of things as doings, as verbs, as activity. And so in which case that is a picture that is far more conducive to change and tolerance, right? If you imagine that what you are is a doing thing, is a being thing, is a process thing, then we're far more sort of open to the idea of change, of movement, of activity. But if you consider yourself as a solid thing, a substantive thing, that's less likely to permit change. One thing I wanted to sort of add, I'm curious as to what you all think. Um, the Buddha describes like aspects of the Noble Eightfold Path in sort of two ways, right? He says, well, there are two kinds, for example, of right view, for instance. There is a right view with flaws, essentially. And the reason why this particular way of practice is with flaws is because it sides with merit. Right, it results in what the Buddha calls acquisition. So basically, the idea is there is a right view, but it is focused on what I can get out of it. So this kind of right, it will take the form of, okay, this is what has been done. This is what I will get, right? This is what has been given. This is what I should receive. This is what has been sacrificed, right? There are fruits and results of good and bad actions. There is this world or the next world. There is these reborn beings, right? There are these beings in the world who know about this world and the next, having realized there's all of this stuff that they have achieved and accomplished and gained, right? So this is not wrong, right? The Buddha never says these things are wrong, but it's a right view with flaws. And it's because the obsession is with what I can get out of it. And so this is a common thing, right? I do spiritual practice because this is what I can get out of it, hopefully. There's something to gain, there is a fruition, there is an acquisition. And then the Buddha goes on to say, well, there is the right view that is without flaws, that is noble and transcendent. And he says, well, this is discernment. So right view without flaws isn't obsessed with fruitions or with any substantive gain, but merely discernment, the faculty of discernment, of awareness, right? And the strength of that awareness, the analysis of the qualities that allow us to liberate ourselves, of awakening. So it's about developing the mind. It's about developing our attention. And so that's it. It's all about being in terms of activity and doing rather than the sort of end product. And I wonder if that sounds similar to like the artistic life, that sometimes what you want to get out of it is not necessarily the finished product. It's like, oh, I've got this thing now, this one, but rather it's the process of creation. Actually, that's the thing. That's the thing I want. It is the process of creation. The end goal, yes, great, that's there, right? It so happens that okay, if I do this, I will, I don't know, become a god. That's there. But if we focus on that kind of spiritual practice, the Buddha says, well, that kind of spiritual practice is sort of tainted in some way, right? If you do these good things because you want some kind of reward, if you do wholesome things because you want to be reborn as a god, then there's something tainted about that. I don't know if that, some artists may say the same thing, right? If I do it for for sort of some sort of substantive goal and I don't actually enjoy the process, then there's something quite tainted about it.
Yeah, there's an idea in the Western tradition. They work through the planets as these aspects of your being. And something my teacher was working on me with is the solar aspect, the sun. The sun is how you present yourself in the world and how you want everything to interact with you, right? The sun's at the center and all these things are orbiting it, right? So he's saying you don't have to believe in the ego you make. It's a tool. You make it to influence how you want to interact with the world, right? And I think as an artist, you got to get creative because things don't always go your way. You don't always have success. You don't always have achievement. And in these downtimes, like I hadn't had a studio for a year, I just finally got one. You have to get creative about what the artistic practice is for you. And I use it in kind of a meditative way to watch the creative processes in me, right? And to gain self-knowledge, which is kind of a neutral thing. There's not really, I mean, you can go brag about it, but there's not really any achievement in realizing I'm not totally my thoughts or my emotions. I kind of have them, right? And then witnessing the creative process, which is the same creative process you do with any interaction throughout the day. This flow from nothing, a will, generating thoughts and stories that move the emotional energy, and then you act, and those actions become habits over time, and that ossifies into a personality. That then later you may have to use your attention to focus on that and burn through it and recreate another one. And it's this ongoing, life is an ongoing creative process. And tapping into the free will, like we're talking about, these creative decisions, is a creative life. I think the artistic life and these things are one of the same, at least for me.
I missed the earlier part, but I just want to know with rebirth, in the sense that you were talking about it, can that happen more than once in your lifetime? Can you have several rebirths?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think usually in times of crisis or maybe even a traumatic event, or it could be a good thing, like you get a job out of nowhere, it's just a big life change. Well, suddenly you have to change. And that is kind of a rebirth. Maybe your first major death in the family, you know, can spark a whole new way of being. Uh, yeah, the process of birth and rebirth is ongoing. It's every moment. Every day you wake up, you're reborn. And then every night you die. You actually dissolve into nothingness every night you go to sleep. And then
Mhm.
you go into this dreams and you wake up into a higher level of density and you start remembering who you are and what you have to do. And then you start your day and then all these things happen and then the day is concluded and those things are part of your past and you're reflecting on it and then you dissolve back into nothing. That's the whole life process in a day.
But you can't force a rebirth. I mean, it happens as part of your, I mean,
I
it,
mean, you can. That's the
you
creative
can.
life. Yeah. Yeah, you can say, I'm done with this. I'm done with this. I say it verbally, I'm done with this. I'm no longer doing this, right? I'm gonna be a sober person. I'm gonna solve this health problem. I'm gonna do this. And that's the hard way. But as soon as you stop doing those things, guess what? It's the past.
Right. We just can't force rebirth for other people, no matter how much we want.
No,
That's the trick.
that's called murder.
I think there's definitely a sense where rebirth is, if you interpret it as just change, it is inevitable. We have to be. But I think for most people, the struggle is not necessarily, can I be reborn? It's the fact that most people actually don't want to change. They fear they would do everything they have in their power to not be reborn. They want to stay there. And so we're kind of, in another way, we're kind of forced to be reborn. Um, as for whether we can force it ourselves, I don't think we can necessarily force rebirth, but we can change the way, the manner in which we are born, right? So we're going to change. That happens regardless of what we do, but we can direct the change. We can steer the change in the direction we would sort of like. And you're right that sometimes it's a very difficult thing to just go, okay, now I will change the flow of things. And in reality, that probably happens sort of with some sort of build-up. Even the strength of will to be able to say that I will stop something. That has happened because of a discipline and training of many years beforehand to get to that point, right? So it's never a case of I'm going to decide now. It's I've trained myself to be the kind of person that is able to decide now I will stop this, and that is actually what makes it possible. And so I think people think that, oh, if I can't do it now, or if I can't make change now, that's something to feel guilty or ashamed about. But that's actually not the case. In reality, it does take a time, and it's a gradual thing. And so it's okay to be a bit forgiving to oneself. Like, okay, I can't do it now, but I will train myself to be the kind of person to be able to say, I will stop some and a helpful habit at some point. Um, yeah, so there's that as well. I think I've heard a very similar version of this where, it's not the journey or the destination, is the person you become on the journey, right? You don't, people think that it's the spiritual practice that is changing you, but actually by engaging in spiritual practice, you become the sort of person that is changed. And so it's not necessarily that if I do this particular thing, I will be changed. It's if you are the kind of person that does these particular things, then as a result of that, there is change. So even if the reason why there shouldn't be an obsession with results and fruition and acquisitions is that a lot of people mistake the fact that, oh, if I don't see some progress or some outcome, therefore this is all for naught, right? Therefore I haven't gained anything, this was useless. But they didn't notice that as a person, the character has changed, right? So even though they didn't get the job they wanted or the promotion they wanted, they still have changed for the better, and that's important too. Whereas if you put all your hopes into something like, I'm worthless if I don't have a bestseller novel, right? Then that becomes difficult. Whereas if you become the kind of person that writes a novel, even though it isn't a bestseller, well, that's still pretty impressive. Um, yeah, for spiritual practice, any kind of spiritually related practice, I think that's quite an important thing.
Yeah, because you're gonna fail. That was the hardest thing for me was, oh, I'm a human. I can't just decide to do stuff and it goes perfectly. No, you're gonna fail a lot, but you change your relationship to the failure. Each failure is like the teacher. Okay, and how did I fail? And then you make a plan. I've talked with you about making a team, right? You need a team of people who can guide you and help you in specific ways, right? So it's not all on you. Okay, this is happening again. I need to reach out to this person. I need to do this. I need to do this. So you have a plan that kind of over time you get better at lessening the damage, right? Depending on the severity of the habit. And over a long period of time, you overcome it, depending on the severity of the habit. Once again, this might be a habit that you can change in a couple months, but some of them take years of effort and may need a constant failure plan in place for the rest of your life, depending on what it is, or if you're even managing a mental health issue. You know, you may have good mental health at one point in time, but it may change in the future. So if you have that plan ready, you lessen the damage. But I think it's hard for some people to see themselves as imperfect people who fail a lot. But if you can look at yourself like that and with some humor, I think success is a lot higher. Yeah. And the Buddhists have this great idea of a fresh start. I always love it when my teachers say that. Just take a fresh start. You don't need to guilt trip. Just start fresh. Anytime you can take a fresh start and do it all over again.
I also like the idea that whatever you do is cumulative. Like if you meditate today and you don't for a week and then you meditate again, it's still, you haven't lost the first meditation. Like it's cumulative. Whatever little thing you do, whether it's yoga or prayer or learning the Bhagavad Gita or whatever, it's all cumulative. You don't lose it. Is that true?
Yeah. What do you think, Dylan?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of, it depends on what the thing is, right? So, um, another way of putting it in Buddhism, we call it an aggregation, a bundle. Right? So a lot of things are in bundles, like including our perception of ourselves, what we think we are. Our forms are bundles, like we are the five aggregates, they say. Even our actions. So the Buddha likes to say our wholesome and unwholesome actions are sort of aggregations as well, right? They're like droplets of water we collect. And it's true that the things that you have already done don't necessarily not exist once you've stopped doing it for a while or things like that. However, its potency might have a time limit. So there is also an emphasis in a kind of perseverance. So it is also true that if you've meditated a week ago, that potency of that meditation might only last maybe for a few months. But after a few months, you genuinely have to start from the beginning again because who you are have changed by then, right? There, the things that you've done as a child, they probably don't have that kind of potency for now. And so that's also a good thing. It means that conditioned phenomena can also cease to be, right? The wrong, even the wrongs that you have done have a time limit. Their potency has a time limit. They will run its course. Its effects will run its course. But if you like that picture, you also have to accept that the good things will also run its course, which is the good thing about perseverance. But I think the point is that if you miss one meditation session, that's not like a big deal. That's also a good thing. The good thing about aggregation is that individual aggregate points in of themselves don't mean a lot. It means that taken as a bundle, they have an effect, right? So in the same vein that if you miss a meditation session, you're not going to lose much. But if you just do one meditation session, that's probably also true that you're not going to gain much. Either way, it will have to be an aggregated effect. And even so, whether that effect is perceptible is another question, right? So maybe you've done something for quite a while, and genuinely it has changed something. It genuinely has had its effect, but you may not have noticed. Right, so people often say, with exercise is a common thing. It's like they genuinely are healthier, but they just don't look like it in the mirror, right? They don't see any perceptible change, but they are healthier, right? They sleep better. It's just that they've chosen to focus on one aspect of exercise, which is being thinner or whatever, right? So it's also about being careful with perception and where you put it. It can be sort of a source of demoralization to focus on all of the meditations that you've missed or whatever. But I think it's perhaps more helpful to just conceive of it as, well, right now I could engage in a little bit of meditation, right? 1 second, 3 seconds, 5 seconds. Right? I don't have to worry about the meditation that I've missed or the meditations I will miss. All I have to worry about is, can I pay a little bit more attention now? And then I know that will have an effect, a positive effect on the now. And so sometimes the Buddha teaches his disciples that it can be unhelpful to obsess too much about the past and too much about the future. It's good to be aware of the past and of the future, but if you let it determine everything about your present, that can be unhelpful. A similar sort of point is made about thoughts, right? So it's good to be aware of thoughts, but it can sometimes be unhelpful to be thinking of thoughts all the time, right? If you have, or if you already have thoughts and you're also thinking of thoughts and they become thoughts and you're thinking about how you think of thoughts, then you wouldn't be really doing anything but thinking about thoughts all the time. So people often mistake mindfulness and meditation as being thoughtful about thoughts, but not necessarily that is about being mindful of thoughts. You're paying attention, you're allowing thoughts to happen, but one has to be careful about not adding even more thoughts to the mix, right? Having a infinite regression of thoughts, and it can get quite messy in that case.
I feel like now, maybe you feel this too, Dylan. I've gotten to a point where if I don't meditate, I feel kind of itchy. I feel kind of like frustrated. Like, I don't know. Do you know what I mean? Or just,
Yeah, different people describe this in different ways. And
yeah.
so I hear people who associate the positive feelings of meditation in terms of temperature, right? So for them, it's the dialogue between heat and cooling. A meditative process is cooling for them. And if they are really sort of anxious or stressed that day, they perceive that kind of meditation as stressed and anxiety-induced meditation as hot. And that there might be something in that because maybe it's their body temperature may genuinely be up because their heart rate's up. So that's their perception. Itchiness I've heard before, right? And sort of just discomfort. My sort of perception of my meditation is associated more with burdensomeness. So heavy and light for me. I think it's maybe something to do with personality as well. For me, having a lot to do feels heavy, right? So if everything is a mess, it feels like a massive burden. It feels heavy, and so meditation is a means of feeling less burdened. It's a light feeling. But that's a really, really good thing to notice because the more positive associations and feelings you can, you can attribute or relate to meditation, then the more likely you are going to do it without having some harsh discipline in place because it's something you want to do anyway. Whereas if meditation is a nightmare and you have to force yourself to do it, then it'll make it more unlikely to be done, right? You won't want to do it. It's a negative experience. So the Buddha often says, well, again, right, this mindfulness thing, meditation in whatever terms has to be enjoyable, right? It has to be a positive experience. If it isn't for you, then something has gone wrong. You're doing it in a faulty manner. You're causing more grief and stress and suffering for yourself. And so maybe a different approach. Maybe it's just the type of meditation. If sitting meditation doesn't work, do some walking meditation, right? Dancing meditation, whatever. But it has to be an enjoyable thing. Otherwise, no, there is no perseverance is possible. No discipline is possible. It's just grief upon grief.
I mean, Zen can get like that.
Yeah, and that's a problem,
For
right? So
sure.
if you associate Zen with being hit by a stick, and it's
Well,
always
what
so
about
much pressure.
you done the Rohatsu? You gotta
I
meditate you do the whole night.
mm,
That's that's a battle. That's a drag
yeah,
out battle.
so I mean there are like if you understand why you are doing it,
Mm.
the feeling of pain during meditation is inevitable, right? So obviously you have a lot of habits and conditions that make it a painful process to some degree. But suffering is not necessarily just pain. Suffering is the added evaluation of pain, right? So if we know what we're doing and we have a goal in mind, then pain does not necessarily equate suffering. You can be in a state of complete euphoria and enjoyment while still feeling pain in your legs, right? Because
Yeah.
you know what you're doing. Any kind of discipline is a bit like that. Art can sometimes be a painful
It
process,
can.
but it's an enjoyable painful process because you know what you're doing. Um, but if it's a painful and suffering process, in that you do not know why you're doing something, you're just there to because you're made to, or you're forced to, or you feel like that it's the right thing to do, then yeah, it's an added suffering for no reason. It's a pointless kind of suffering. And so the Buddha says, like, that is self-mortification. That is one of the extremes we should avoid, right? On one hand, you have sort of self-indulgence, that's an extreme we should avoid, but also intentional self-torture for no reason at all is also sort of an extreme, right? The right approach is always the middle way, right? So it need not be a particular time frame.
Yeah.
It need not be a particular context. In nowadays, because a lot of this stuff is in monasteries or in training or in particular schools, it's a very, very structured thing. But certainly in the Buddhist time, there is no structure to meditation, right? It is whenever you have free time, right? And so the monks would just sit whenever. There's no like, oh, you have to sit for an hour or this many minutes. Because how would they know? They have no watches or clocks, right? They sit because they want to, and then when they no longer want to, they get up, do something else. But I can understand that nowadays that's a bit difficult to do in a controlled environment. You can't have like 100 students in a room all getting up at random times. So yeah, there
Those
has
are
to
the
be some
long ones.
adaptability. Yeah.
The long. It was in the it was surprising to me in the most advanced teachings I got, the meditations were extremely short. Um, the Lama told me like 5 minutes in the morning, a little glances through the day for a few seconds, and at night 10 minutes. But it's through the whole day, right? These little interruptions throughout the day. But some of those longs in, I just remember it being like, like the airplane head. You're
Yeah, being sleepy and yeah.
like,
I think the time for
yeah,
meditation depends on the thing that you're trying to resolve, right? So
yeah,
at the end of the day, like concentrated meditation, you're trying to resolve or dissolve a particular bias or a particular
mm,
habit of thinking, right? And so depending on how ingrained that problematic habit of thinking is, that will require a certain amount of time, right? But
mm,
there is no sort of criteria for how much for your problems may be so minuscule that it only takes 5 or 10 minutes, or your problems may be so deeply ingrained because it's a product of culture and tradition. So it's not just you trying to resolve this problem. This has been a problem for a very, very long time.
mm,
And so it will take months and months and months and months of deep sort of critical thinking to get through. And so it depends on the problem, right? Some medication works quickly, some medication works slowly. It depends on the illness. Um, so yeah, I think yeah, but I can understand, right? Having a structure to certain lessons, especially if they're sort of tasters as well. Like people want to have a sense of what this is about, right? And
Oh
having a
God,
structured
yeah.
environment is sort of, I think, for your purposes, right? For
Yep.
teaching meditation. Like a lot of people don't really have a deep understanding of why meditation, what it's for, and what they're dealing with yet. And so, yeah, if you tell them get up whenever you'd like, they would go, well, I'd like to get up now. They wouldn't do any of it. Um,
I've had a
yeah.
lot of like newish students. They haven't meditated much at all. They're like, I want to do a 10 days silent Vipassana retreat. I'm like, you're gonna die.
Yeah.
You what? Oh my God. Are you kidding me? Like, I don't even know if I could do that.
Well, the thing is, if they want to do it, there's nothing stopping them,
Yeah,
right?
go
They can
ahead.
just it could be a self-initiated thing, right? And very quickly they'll realize whether it's for them or not, right? The silent thing is another interesting sort of modern addition, right? There's a particular notable story from the Patimokkha, the Buddha's discussion on discipline, where a community of monks decided to engage in silence because they saw another community of a different religion practice this silence. So the Buddha basically admonished them. It's like, why would you swear to perpetual silence, right? Practice requires dialogue, right? Of course, not meaningless dialogue, but you need to be able to talk with one another. You need to be able to
Mhm.
engage in fruitful conversation. By enforcing silence, you are denying the ability not only for yourself to ask for sort of advice, but you're denying others the opportunity to ask for support and advice.
Yeah.
So communication is important. Um, but I can also understand that in an era of a lot of idle chatter, people would like to have a period of time where there's just total silence. But at the cost of the opportunity of meaningful conversation as well. If you rule something out completely, you also
Mhm.
remove any opportunity of genuine, meaningful communication. So again, like there's going to be um, sort of an upside and a downside to any kind of practice if you take it to a certain extreme, if this is the way it must be done. um, but again, maybe a product of the modern time, right? If you didn't impose sort of a silence, then maybe all you're going to get is idle chatter. Depends on the community.
The thing in the West they make fun of is heroic practice.
Hmm.
Because there's a lot of long rituals and things, and it's very typical to get someone who's like new, who's like energized, and they're gonna like, I'm gonna do this for so many hours every day. And what the teachers do there, they let them get it out of their system. Like
Yeah,
they gotta get over it. They gotta get
yeah,
over this thing with themselves so they can get to actually practicing.
yeah. Oh, there's a lot of like retreats, right? There is this idea that there is a crash course for
Yeah,
spiritual practice, crash course enlightenment. Right? If you do something really intensively, then you can get at it quicker. Um, but there's no guarantee, and it's sort of probably healthier to take your time.
yeah.
Um,
I think for if you're learning a very technical new thing, it can be helpful to do a 2 or 3 day retreat
mhm.
just to get it, just to see, not have any distractions, but to see how it works. Those have been very useful. But those are
Yeah.
like maybe one of those a year, just when you're learning a new type of technique. Um, I don't know.
Yeah, kind of taster, right? Even the Buddha has
Yeah,
this principle in place for monks, right?
yeah,
If you're unsure whether this life is for you, yeah, take some time, maybe, a week, a month, live that kind of lifestyle. Because you need evidence, right? You need the facts to be able to
yeah,
decide whether you're going to commit to any kind of practice. And even though it's not going to give you the full experience, right? You need to know if you're the kind of person that this is for you.
yeah,
Um, and so, yeah, to blindly commit to something isn't going to work either. And having these short retreats is a good idea. It's just that expectations have to be set. Like, you cannot expect to attend like a taster retreat and expect to get something monumental. You may do, right? It's a possibility. But if that's what you think, right, is the case, then you're going to be very disappointed most of the time.
uh, yeah, just talk,
Uh,
man.
Dylan, I have a question for you. Is your motivation in life to seek enlightenment? Is
Oh,
that your motivation to seek enlightenment?
not really. My motivation, if you'd like, is to have less suffering, right? Either for myself or just overall, right? And so, interestingly, for the Buddha, enlightenment is not the goal. Not the goal. It's the tool, right? The reason why we bother with being more aware, and paying more attention and trying to gain wisdom is that because that leads to less suffering.
Okay.
And so that's sort of what I think of as in terms of spiritual practice. The other interesting thing within certain schools of Buddhism is that enlightenment is kind of like an illusory label. It doesn't actually exist, but it's sort of a way of talking about something that doesn't exist. So, for example, there is that story where um, a monk was sort of reaches a river and wants to cross. And it's a common symbol within Buddhism that crossing the river is an analogy for spiritual practice, for liberation, to cross a river. And so the monk sort of approaches the river and he sees an older monk on the other side. And he says, he reaches out, it's like, hey, how do I cross to the other side? How did you get over to the other side? And then the older monk goes, well, but you are on the other side. And so enlightenment is something you already have. Awareness is something you already possess. Right? It's just a matter of perspective. Enlightenment doesn't exist. You're merely changing your perspective into realizing that you are already it. You are already there. You're already on the other side. And so it's merely a process of changing perspective, of training one's awareness and perspective. Enlightenment as a thing, as an event, doesn't actually exist in a kind of substantial or metaphysical sense. It's merely a placeholder, a way of talking about this thing, so that in the beginning of spiritual practice, we have a means of communicating a kind of goal. So it's a little bit like going hiking and having like a place marker for 10 kilometers. That place marker isn't really designating anything objective in the universe, right? It's merely a place marker so that when you see it, you can go, oh, I'm there. Or you can go, or it's a bit of encouragement. It's like, oh, I've reached 10 kilometers. I'm nearly there. It's a means of encouragement. So even in Buddhism, all of the labels of fruition is that you will achieve this, you will achieve that, you'll achieve this. All of them don't actually exist. They're all like goalposts. They're all place markers, a means of encouragement. It's to say, you've come so far, keep going, right? Or this is the general direction you want to head, right? Keep going, right? Here's a goal that we have given a name to, keep going. But in of itself, it's not really designating anything. So even something as the true self, the true nature, Buddha nature, all of these things are also sort of helpful, but ultimately illusory labels. The Buddha nature doesn't really exist in the way that we think of it. It's a label, right? So there's a common Zen koan in which a monk asks his disciple, does a dog have Buddha nature? I don't know if Josh, if you've heard this one before. Do you have an answer? Like, does a dog have Buddha nature? What do you think?
I think it does.
Mhm. Yeah, because the Buddha has clearly said in one of the teachings that all sentient beings have Buddha nature, right? So clearly a dog has Buddha nature. To which the older monk basically just hits the young monk and says, no, right? The dog does not have Buddha nature. And so the disciple is very confused. Like, what do you mean? Like the Buddha has clearly said all sentient beings have Buddha nature. How can a dog not have Buddha nature? And so the monk flips the question. He says, well, consider this. Does a Buddha have dog nature? So if the Buddha has no dog nature, how can a dog have Buddha nature? The thing in which we think, right? The label doesn't actually exist, right? It's merely an ability. The ability, what we call Buddha nature, is merely the ability of awareness, of enlightenment, right? The Buddha considers him the awakened one. To be awakened is an ability. It's not a thing, right? It's not something you can have. A dog cannot have Buddha nature in the same way that one cannot have, running in their legs. You can run as an ability, but you cannot possess running. And so a dog cannot have Buddha nature, but a dog can exercise the ability of awakening, right? Can pay attention. So these are common labels we can use just so that we can talk about these things. But ultimately, it's very, very, very important to acknowledge that they don't really designate anything substantial, right? It's not that they don't exist. It's not that they're referring to anything, but not just not solid, concrete things. So basically, the point is not to be too worried about this notion of enlightenment, right? Not to go like, am I enlightened yet? Am I enlightened? Am I enlightened? Well, how long is enlightenment? How far am I from enlightenment? Those things, that kind of obsession with enlightenment will keep one from doing the thing that actually makes you enlightened, which is to pay attention, right?
Thank you.
So ironically, obsession with enlightenment will keep you from enlightenment.
Thank you.
I think of it in two ways. Um, in very mundane ways. One, enlightenment could just be the commitment to a path that you never give up on.
Mhm.
So if you never give up, the end is already there, right? It's just a matter of time.
Mhm.
Kind of like what you said about like if we're changing a habit, if you commit to that habit through endless failures, and that's your goal, you've already attained it
Mhm.
in a way. It's just a matter of time.
Yeah.
So committing to a path and often just a simple practice, you know, I think is the most effective way. And so through that simple practice, that commitment, you're constantly evolving your perspective on your life and yourself. And that's that ongoing changes, little moments of, aha, oh, I see everything in a new way. That's enlightenment as an ongoing process. Another perspective I take on enlightenment is noticing in a world of moving things what isn't moving. What doesn't change? What is actually stable? And like what we said earlier, you find it in not finding it. You find it this apophatic way of elimination. You find this ground of being that doesn't change. And I can see that in a dog. I can see that in anything, but it's not a concept. If it's in a concept, if in his name, it's not it. If it's in a place, it's not it. If it's in a time, it's not it. It cannot change. It has to be a type of nothingness, a relation to an experiential relationship to a nothingness. And it's extremely mundane because it has to be, because it's always there. It's extremely boring and mundane and probably disappointing. What's the I don't know, what do you think, Dylan, about those two?
Yeah, I think you're definitely right. I think people often say that in the moments in which you are aware, in the moments that you're being empathetic and kind and generous and forgiving, in those moments, you are already the Buddha, right? You are behaving in the exact way a Buddha would behave,
Mm-hmm.
right? You are an enlightened being.
Mm-hmm.
It's only that when you're in those moments where you are sort of violent and rude and unhelpful, right? That's when you are not a Buddha. So it's only a matter of consistency. But in terms of ability, we've all got it, right? In the moment that a dog unconditionally loves, right, a human, in those moments, the dog is enlightened, is a Buddha, right? But in those moments where it sort of bites, right? It gets really aggressive and bullies another smaller dog, right? In those moments, it is not a Buddha, right? So it's merely, again, it's a question of sort of consistent and using the ability that is already there, right? Clearly, the dog has the ability of a conditional love, right? You've seen it. However, it also has the ability to be jealous sometimes, right? And to be sort of uh, violent. And so accepting these parts as part of ourselves and having, again, just something we mentioned last time, Buddha pride, right? We already have the ability to act like a Buddha. We already have the ability to be aware, is an important reminder as well. So in that sense, right, enlightenment is there or as real as your embodiment of it, right? If you're being an enlightened person, you're acting in an enlightened way, and for you, it exists. Right? The moment you stop acting in that manner, it has disappeared. Right? It is no longer the case. Um,
And that kind of goes with the relative and dual. Like remember the path of prayer thing where you pick an ideal and you try to align yourself with that ideal through your thoughts, through your words, through your actions. There's moments of alignment. I call that maybe a relative enlightenment, right? That commitment to that thing. But a non-dual enlightenment is where you just find this kind of nothingness, right? That is neither good or bad.
Mhm.
It's outside of action.
Yeah. Outside of sort of phenomenal sort of
Any phenomenon. Yeah.
yeah, phenomenal experience. And that's in a sense is why therein lies a kind of true freedom, right? The Buddha is described to be free from conditionality, free from phenomena.
Mhm.
So insofar as interacting with phenomena, as long as we're interacting with the world, we are bound to the world's rules, right? We are conditioned because we simply cannot snap our fingers and make things happen, right? We are bound to certain rules. But beyond phenomena, right? If we're not sort of acting within conditionality, then yeah, we are free. And so yeah, I think there's an element of um, peace in that emptiness. So even though it's non-phenomenal,
Yeah.
uh, it may sound very, very cold and uninviting, but it's a kind of secure peace in there as well, right? You no longer have to answer to any conditionality. You're no longer being forced to do one thing or another, right?
Yeah, if you're alive, they're both happening at the same time. But if you're dead,
Yeah.
you're just in this non-dual. Nothing.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, and even
yeah.
when it's happening at the same time, it depends on your perspective, right?
Hmm.
So as long as you are acting with awareness and the intentions and the will that you are having are genuinely the ones you want, right? The ones that are coming from a place of wisdom, then that doesn't cause too much bother, right? That's not going to be a problem. You're at once moving but unmoved, right? So that's perfectly okay. The trouble is that if you're moving and you're moved, sort of mentally speaking, then you're going to sort of suffer. Or alternatively, right, the world is moving, but you don't want to move, right? You're sort of stuck somewhere. Um, there's that as well.
All right. Any last questions or statements? Pam? You done, Pam? So let's come into our seat and may this love flow outwards, igniting the hearts of all beings, illuminating endless dawns. All right. Thank you guys, and I'll try to get this posted soon. Thank you, Dylan, for coming again. I
Thank
hope
you for having me.
Thank you, everybody who showed up.